This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell is extra this week?
What the hell is extra is Israel struck Iran over the weekend. Finally, after much waiting, the headline in the Washington Post is Israel says it pulled punches in Iran's strike. President Biden publicly said, don't hit the nuclear sites, don't hit the oil, and Israel didn't hit the nuclear sites and didn't hit the oil, though they did take out their ballistic missile capability, they took out their air defenses, so they could hit the nuclear sites if they wanted to, they could hit the oil if Iran isn't smart and doesn't stand down. They pulled their punches. I'm interested in what you think of that, Danny. Was that under pressure from the Biden administration? Was that a Israeli calculation that was the best strategic move to make? I'm not sure. You tell me.
Well, I mean, look, we're sitting here in our comfy studio / living rooms talking about what the best choice for the Israeli government is. And I guess second guessing them is a little bit presumptuous. I would have liked, I'm just going to say what I would have liked to see. I would have liked to see them hit the nuclear sites because I don't think there are actually a lot of opportunities. We have our recidivist colleague Fred Kagan on talking about this, and he rightly says you don't want to do that in bites. You want to do that if you're going to do it, toward what did Shakespeare say? "Twere done, twere well done quickly." I'm sure I screwed that quote up, but I guess Israel cannot treat Iran like it treats Hamas, like it treats Hezbollah, like it treats the Houthis, which is keep coming back and slapping them again. Because if they're going to do the nuclear sites, they've got to do them for once and for all. And for whatever reason, probably because of pressure from the United States, at least in part, they didn't do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I agree with Fred, though I rarely disagree with Fred. But I think if you can set back the nuclear program significantly without totally taking it out, and you have the pretext to do it because you weren't doing it on your own initiative, you had a free pass because Iran decided to attack Israel, and so you had a pretext to go ahead and do it, I would have done all that. But again, like you say, we're here sitting here second guessing Israel, who actually lives in the dangerous neighborhood and has to make these decisions for itself. But he's right in the sense that they did take out the ballistic missile capabilities, which is, if you have a nuclear weapon but you don't have a missile to put it on, then you can blow yourself up, I suppose, but but you can't hit. It's pretty hard to hit Israel without a ballistic missile that can reach there. So, to some extent, they did set back the nuclear program with their strikes, which is a good thing.
Yeah, no, listen, it's a good thing. I think the problem for us is, honestly, we have no decisive policy. I did a webinar, a session with a group of leading conservative women from around the world. Our friends at the International Democratic Union have this women's group that I really like. There was a Lebanese political leader on, and she was saying the same thing that you and I say. We can keep complaining about Hezbollah, we can keep complaining about the Houthis, we can keep complaining about Hamas, and the Israelis can hit the crap out of them. The reality is, when you hit them, you're only buying time because the head of the snake is left intact, So we need a policy on Iran, and we just don't have one. And even, I would say, even the Trump administration, which had the excellent maximum pressure campaign, didn't have an end game for that maximum pressure campaign. And, one hoped that there was an ultimatum at the end of it, get rid of the nuclear weapons or else. But I suspect that there wasn't. And I worry that if Trump is reelected, we're again going to have a policy of ambiguity towards Iran.
I guess so, but I will tell, I agree with you on the policy towards Iran and the fact that we don't have a strategy, and all that is true. But I don't think you should understate the value of taking out some of these people. I'm a big believer.
I'm happy to see them dead.
Well, I mean, but it's more than that. I think as you know, when we have slight disagreement over this, but I'm a believer in the great man theory of history. I believe that history is made by great men, both good and evil, right? And so when we took out Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri has not exactly been a bin Laden-esque figure in terms of the effectiveness of al-Qaeda. We took out, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and took him off the battlefield. Then we started killing all the operational commanders of al-Qaeda, and then we took out bin Laden. And al-Qaeda has been a shadow of itself ever since because they don't have a charismatic leader that can rally the world's jihadi forces. When we took out al-Baghdadi, that was a big blow to ISIS. So taking out the leadership of Hamas, taking out the leadership of Hezbollah, yeah, the snake may grow another head, but it's not the same head. The effectiveness of the organization can be decimated by the elimination of these long-standing charismatic leaders. It could set them back significantly more than just simply a temporary setback.
Oh, no. I mean, listen, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think, by the way, that both Hamas and Hezbollah are in complete strategic, tactical, military disarray. And, they may be pretending not to, but I have not read a single good analysis that suggests that the Israelis are not, taking them out, chopping them up in pieces, and really, really doing serious damage. What I'm trying to say is at a certain point, we can go through this cycle again and again and again. We're certainly not losing lives. We talked about Israeli loss of life. We're not dying. Decent Lebanese who are under Hezbollah's thumb, decent Palestinians insofar as there are any in Gaza, and there are dying under Hamas's thumb. But the real problem that I see in this cyclical slaughter, if you will, of Israel's enemies is that eventually Iran will have a nuclear weapon. And I got to say, people think that, and I know that people in this administration, I know people at the CIA think that Iran is a rational actor. And I think they are full of it. Iran is not a rational actor. And at a time of its choosing, it could either use or share a nuclear weapon. You can't kill the leader after that. It's happened.
No, I agree with you 100%, which is why I think this was sort of a missed opportunity. And look, look at what Iran has done now without a nuclear weapon. They had Hamas commit the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. They've attacked Israel twice directly, and they don't have a nuclear weapon to protect themselves. Imagine what they would do if they had one.
Exactly.
Imagine it. And so it should be a fundamental policy of the United States that we will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon, period, full stop. And why wait?
Well, why wait till the point when it becomes much, much harder?
Exactly.
Exactly. No, listen, you and I agree about this, and I think that's the point. But hey, let's talk to Frederick Kagan.
Someone who knows what they're talking about.
Yes, well, that's never stopped us before. But what the heck? Everybody remembers Fred because he's amazing. He's our colleague. Frederick W. Kagan is the director of AI's Critical Threats Project. He's a former professor of military history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He has written numerous pieces. He is our guru on the war, Russia's war on Ukraine. He's our guru with his critical threats team on Iran and on Salafi jihadis. He is our guru with our sister institution, the Institute for the Study of War on Russia. He's all that.
Here's our interview. Fred, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Mark and Danny. It's great to be with you.
It's awesome to have you, as always. So we've been anxiously awaiting this Israeli strike, and the bombs have landed, the smoke has cleared, and the Iranian oil infrastructure and nuclear infrastructure remains fully intact. Was this strike a success, a failure, or something in between?
Well, I think it was a significant strike. I think first of all, it's not entirely clear to me. We have to talk about what you mean by nuclear infrastructure, because that's a little bit complicated.
Okay.
But no, I think the strike was actually very successful and very important. As everybody's been reporting, the Israelis did a lot of damage to the Iranian air defense system, especially ripping up the Russian S-300 long-range air defenses that people have really, been worrying about what their impact would be. on Israel's ability to strike Iran or our ability to strike Iran. And the Israelis just demonstrated actually they just solved that problem. And that's a big deal. And we've seen the reports, I'm sure you've seen them also, that has made the Iranians extremely nervous and feeling very vulnerable, as they should, because the Israelis have just demonstrated that they can basically strike with impunity. That's an important thing in itself. We can talk about how interesting it is in the context of what the Ukrainians have been doing to the S-300s and thinking about the cross-theater implications of this strike. But beyond that, the Iranians also, the Israelis, I don't know why I keep saying this, because I'm used to the Iranians bombing things, I think is the reason. But the Israelis also apparently did a lot of damage to a critical facility that supports the Iranian missile program. And that is obviously important and directly related to the Iranian missile attacks on Israel. It's also relevant potentially for Iran's ability to continue to export missiles to Russia. But beyond that, it's one of the reasons why I say we need to be clear about what we're talking about when we're talking about the nuclear program. No, they didn't hit centrifuges. No, they didn't hit the enrichment. I've seen some reports, which I haven't been able to look into, about whether they did or did not damage some potential weaponization research. But a nuclear arsenal program involves three major components. It involves the ability to produce large quantities of highly enriched uranium. It involves the ability to turn them into a weapon, and it involves delivery systems. You have to have a way of delivering the systems. So, as the Israelis have apparently just degraded the Iranians' ability to field delivery systems, that is a blow to the Iranian nuclear weapons program, and it shouldn't be discounted.
So, right. I mean, look, all of us have a tendency to Monday morning quarterback the Israeli actions. And, we do so with a lot more knowledge than maybe the average guy, but still not the full and complete knowledge. So, Fred, this was obviously, no matter what, this was an operation that the Israelis carried off flawlessly, 120 or so jets, refueling spy planes, more than 1,500 kilometers all the way. Didn't scratch a hair on the head of these lovely four women who they sent off or anybody else. And so that in and of itself operationally is great. Can I get you to just dive a little bit into some of the work that you and the critical threats team, Nick Carl, and all of the guys that we have at AEI have done in the analysis here? So they hit Parchin, they hit Hojir, they hit Shig. Can you just talk a little bit for our listeners about what those three things are?
Sure. So Parchin is an expansive facility that has been linked to the Iranian nuclear program for a long time. It was the subject of International Atomic Energy Agency preoccupation for weaponization research that the Iranians had done. The IAEA found traces of uranium there, asked the Iranians for an explanation. Instead of giving an explanation, the Iranians bulldozed the building and replaced the soil, which is obviously what you would do if there was nothing to find. That facility is clearly linked to the nuclear program in a lot of interesting ways. It's a big facility, and there's a lot of stuff going on there. It's a major signal. And I do want to be clear about something. I don't really approve of sending messages by missile, okay? I think if you're going to be using the weapons of war, then you should be pursuing objectives that are suitable for using military force. I don't really like signaling in this way. But the Israelis, among other things, did signal that they are willing and able to hit Parchin, which means that they've demonstrated that they are willing and able to hit any of the above ground parts of the Iranian nuclear program, including the weaponization program, and that they don't regard it as off limits. And that is a very significant signal. They also hit Shig, the Shahid Hemati industrial group, which was under U.S. sanctions for its involvement in the missile proliferation program and the nuclear program. And that is another major element of the collective overall Iranian nuclear arsenal effort. And again, this is a demonstration to the Iranians that the Israelis don't regard any of this stuff as off limits, and that they can and will hit it, and that the more that presumably the more the Iranians choose to continue shooting at Israel, the more of this stuff the Israelis will chew through. And in combination with the destruction of the S-300 systems, it's also a demonstration that the Iranians have no ability to defend themselves from these strikes. And that's a very important message to get over. And again, because we've seen, the team has reported that we've had the Iranians convene an emergency Supreme National Security Council meeting, again, They're keeping Khamenei busy, and he must be getting rather tired at his age. That shows that that message was received. But going back to your earlier point, I want to flag that the one thing that's probably not going to happen is that the Russians are going to be sending any replacement for the S-300 systems that the Israelis just destroyed.
Why?
Because they don't have a lot to send. Because they need them desperately to defend their forces that have invaded Ukraine. And the Ukrainians have shown their own ability to destroy these systems. And because of the much maligned sanctions that the US and its international partners have imposed on Russia, the Russians cannot mass produce the critical components of these systems, especially the radars. I would be very surprised if you see S-300 systems turning up in Iran again anytime soon. And by the way, it's not clear what the point of that would be anyway, since the Israelis just displayed the ease with which they can actually destroy them. If you'll tolerate me doing this, I can zoom out for another minute and just say, we've all been possibly overestimating the efficacy of these Russian air defense systems and the challenges that they were going to pose to us.
Absolutely.
And I think, you obviously need to be careful because, yes, this was Iranians operating, not the first-in-class Russian, S-300 system. But I'm thinking that the Russians are operating the best-in-class Russian systems that they have. And the Ukrainians have been knocking those out with fair regularity using drones and basic, precision missiles. So I do think that there's a fundamental reevaluation that we all should go through here about exactly how intimidated we feel like the United States military needs to be by the presence of these kinds of systems that both the Israelis and the Ukrainians have demonstrated that they can defeat.
That is so true. And, we all remember when we were discussing the imperative, even during the Obama administration and then during the Trump administration, of hitting Syria after Assad was violating the Chemical Weapons Convention and using barrel bombs, yada, yada, yada. And the U.S. military was, and again, I love these guys. They're the bravest, they're the best, they're the brightest. But in terms of the people who were making the bureaucratic decisions about the efficacy of the enemy defenses, absolutely. If the Israelis can kick their butts, and by the way, fly also with impunity over the installations that are manned by Russians in Syria, then we can certainly kick their butts. So that is extraordinarily troubling. I wanted to follow up with a question about Iranian defenses. It was obvious that they recognized that their defenses didn't work. Fred, you and I were both online watching in real time the Iranian responses to the Israeli attacks, and there was real-time disinformation coming out of the IRGC organs, the government press, saying, oh no, those noises you heard weren't the Israelis or anybody else. That was the activity of our defense system. And then you see them shooting stuff up in the air, obviously not hitting anything, detonating it in the air. Obviously the Iranians know this. Do they have the capacity to improve it? And are we overestimating everything else about them too?
Look, I don't think it's likely that the Iranians are going to field anything that is going to help them deal with F-35s anytime soon. That's always been my basic answer to people who've told me about how we can't handle the Israelis can't handle the S-300 or the S-400, this is why S-35s were built in no small part. Now, I've seen the reports that, in fact, the S-300s were hacked before the strike went in. I can't verify those. But again, we've seen the Ukrainians do this without F-35s. Of course, F-35s can do this. Look, we saw even in the 90s that stealth aircraft, if you make mistakes, can be taken down by people who in principle don't have the ability to take them down, right? We lost F-117s in the Kosovo War by flying the same route repeatedly and forgetting that people have eyeballs even if radar doesn't see stuff. So it is important not to become complacent about this. And I also, you don't want to dismiss the fact that it didn't work here doesn't mean that it can never work. But no, that's a very long answer, so I'll give you the direct answer. No, I don't see any likelihood that the Iranians are going to be able to field an air defense system to defend against Israeli F-35s or the kinds of strike that the Israelis just conducted anytime soon.
I just have to note to you what I noted. Mark and I noted for our event that we did on October 7th when I asked Dave Deptula the same question, General Dave Deptula, Air Force vet. He said, "Put me in, coach. I won't say anymore.
So does this strike essentially mean that every inch of Iran is vulnerable now to Israel? That if they do anything, that they've basically laid the groundwork where they can take out leadership targets, nuclear sites, whatever. Are the Iranians now essentially defenseless against an Israeli counterstrike if they struck again?
Look, I mean, to me, this strike validated what I have long thought, which was that the Israelis would be able to conduct airstrikes against Iran more or less as they chose in terms of defeating the Iranian air defense systems. From which I have also concluded that the Israelis are able to strike any particular above ground target without any question and destroy buried targets for which it's reasonable for which we either know or can conjecture that the Israelis can deal with, for example, like the facilities at Natanz, which are not buried very deeply. The big question is always the Fordo enrichment facility. And here, as soon as you start talking with anybody who knows, they stop talking because stuff's all classified. Apparently, we have weapons that can penetrate that deeply. I've heard various things about whether we've shared them with the Israelis or not. I have no idea. That's the issue. And this is, as people sometimes talk a little bit too cavalierly about taking out the Iranian nuclear program, at the heart of this is can the Israelis destroy Fordo? If they know where all the stuff is that they need to hit, and if nothing is buried more deeply than Fordo, then yes, they can destroy the physical Iranian nuclear program. Now, I'm inclined to think that it's unlikely that the Iranians actually have an extensive program that the Israelis are unaware of, for the simple reason that the Israelis seem to have penetrated Iran in a way that is absolutely humiliating for every Iranian intelligence officer. So I would be surprised if the Israelis will be surprised by anything that they find in terms of the nuclear program. But I don't know whether they can destroy Fordo, and that's the big question.
So let me reframe the question I asked you initially, because after the Iranian strike on Israel, President Biden went out and said Israel has the right to defend itself, but don't hit the nuclear program. And oh, by the way, don't hit the oil refineries. And it seems like the Israelis did what he told them. Did the Biden administration effectively restrain Israel from carrying out the strike that they would have preferred to take? Or is this another example of the Biden administration pulling a leash on Israel? Or did the Israelis just do what they wanted to do, and this was the optimal strike from their perspective?
I have no idea. You'd have to ask the Israelis what they were trying to achieve.
Well, I'm asking your informed opinion.
Look, again, going back to, are they going to hit the nuclear program? In my judgment, it is of limited utility to go after the nuclear program and try to destroy Iran's ability to make a nuclear weapon physically if you can't reliably destroy the key component of it, which is Fordo. So I just don't know whether the Israelis think they can or cannot do that. If they don't, then they are well advised not to go after it partially, in my judgment. I don't know
Why?
what leaders... Because you're starting something that you can't finish and you're not striking a decisive blow. And it doesn't accomplish the core of the mission. If the mission is to destroy Iran's ability to field a bomb, you need to be able to destroy Fordo. Otherwise, you haven't accomplished that. So you need to have an answer to that question. But again, I really want to cut short this speculation because I really have no basis for an opinion about whether they can do that or not. I'm simply saying that if you are planning an air campaign to destroy the Iranian physical nuclear program, that's going to be the first question on your mind, and you're probably going to be reluctant to go after other big parts of it if you're not able to do that, because that's really the heart of it.
So you bring up something really important. I think that coverage of this strike has been divided between people who are saying, okay, the Israelis were, I'll use the George H.W. Bush word, prudent in not
Not gonna do
escalating
it.
to right, not escalating to regional war, yada yada, blah blah. Jake Sullivan, hysteria. Okay, so that's one piece of coverage. That's sort of the White House spin, right? Okay, one and done. They did it. You better not come back. Now we're finished. It was interesting, though, that others, and I'm sorry, dog barking in the background, the foxes love to taunt them. But the other take, which is the Wall Street Journal, the British Spectator, a bunch of other publications are like, okay, this was an excellent step one, right? Now the Israelis have cleared out the ground clutter that the Iranians will use to defend themselves, and now they can go in big time, bigly, as our future, once and future president would say, can go in bigly and whack the crap out of their nuclear program. If you were designing, and again, we're in a kind of an awkward position because we're making stuff up here. We don't know what the Israelis are thinking, as you very fairly said. But if you were designing a staged approach to this, is that what you would be thinking as well? Or just help us think it through. Help us think through which answer is right.
Well, look, I mean, this is unquestionably a step, as you say, to clear out the obstacles in the way of a more significant strike, and it was meant to message that as well to the Iranians, that they ought to think pretty hard about how far down this path they feel like going. I'm going to come back to the question of a regional war because we have a regional war. That's what's going on here, and I really do increasingly object to the whole framing of escalation. I've always objected to that, honestly. But when one state is using military force against another state, it's commonly called a war. And I think there's a virtue to recognizing that there is a war going on in the Middle East, the most recent iteration of which was initiated by Hamas on October 7th. The Israelis are in the process, in my judgment, of doing something that's actually more important in many respects than going after the nuclear program right now. And that is, having largely destroyed Hamas as a meaningful military threat to the south, at least for now, they are in the process of demolishing Hezbollah and demonstrating that Hezbollah is also a considerably weaker power than we have all long thought. And in that process of doing those two things, they are in the process of fundamentally transforming the security architecture in the Middle East to Israel's advantage and ours. And I personally think that in many respects, it's more important for them to continue advancing that project than to get into striking a nuclear program that, at least as far as we can tell, is not more advanced. It's not advancing faster or more advanced than we have thought that it was, while simultaneously demonstrating that they have the ability to hit it at will if it appears that it is going to cross some threshold that is unacceptable. So from that standpoint, it seems prudential for me, not because, oh my God, the Iranians might otherwise escalate in some way, but because it is avoiding becoming embroiled in yet another major effort while they are already embroiled in two very important major efforts.
That's a very, that's a very sober assessment, and I think we don't hear enough commentary in that vein because we have a tendency to focus on that sparkly thing, ooh, squirrel, ooh, squirrel. So it's Hamas. Have you noticed that we're like barely talking about Hamas anymore, right? And Hezbollah. But then we stop talking about Hezbollah too. It's like our attention span is really short. I wanted to ask
Israel
you
keeps hitting the squirrels.
Yes, well, that's true too.
There's a squirrel. Oh, no, squirrel's gone.
Dead
There's
squirrel.
another squirrel. Oh, that squirrel's gone. It's like they're sitting there on the top of the hill with a BB gun taking out the squirrels. That's why you keep saying squirrel.
I will say this. I only wish that it wasn't with the very serious number of casualties that they're taking in Lebanon. Do you realize that they've lost almost 800 soldiers
Oh my gosh.
in this ongoing war? For a country like Israel, losing 800 soldiers, almost all of them young men and a couple of young women and some older reservists. It's it's shitty. Yeah, it's a terrible thing. And while I love dead Nasrallah memes more than the next man, it's come at a very high price. So I'll say that. But I actually had a little just tiny asterisk question for you. How worrisome do you think it should be to us when you talk about the regional architecture and you talk about the sway that Iran's tentacles really have managed to achieve over the last few years? How worrisome is it to you that all of these sheep-like Arab neighbors of Iran came running to the White House before the attack on Iran to say, don't hurt my friend, don't do anything naughty and bad, because the Iranians went from house to house to house to them to warn them that they needed to do so. I ask you that from 2 points. One, from the standpoint of the Gulf Arabs and who they are, but also from the perspective of their confidence in the United States, right?
I mean, Danny, look, the truth is you know them better than I do, and performative messaging of that variety is rather normal in the region. I tend to regard it with a fairly jaundiced eye because I think it's largely delivered without the expectation that it's going to have any particular effect one way or the other. So, look, I don't really care that much what they say. What I care is what they do. And the Israelis clearly flew across some airspace to get to Iran. Nobody could have really stopped them in particular. Nobody tried. Okay, that's important. The Iranians had warned the Jordanians not to let that happen. I don't know what the Iranians thought the Jordanians could do about that, but they did. The Saudi, as far as I can tell, the basic Saudi response to this has been to ask us to help them defend themselves against a potential future Iranian strike, which is an important thing for us to do. I think there's a lot of, don't think, there's a huge amount of posing that goes on. The Iranians basically, look, the Iranians just did a whole bunch of demonstrative message, finger wagging at a bunch of states that I think they have no serious intention of getting into it with right now. Ask those states to do some finger wagging at us. They wag their fingers at us, and the Israelis just bomb Iran. None of those states are doing anything about that. I don't see why I should be particularly concerned about the finger wagging.
So, exit question for me, Fred. Since we have you here, you mentioned the spillover effects in Ukraine of this. While we've got you, we're hearing there are North Korean troops now deployed in Ukraine or towards Ukraine. What's going on with the North Koreans there, and also what's going on in Kursk? Because I've heard that the Russians have been launching a counteroffensive in Kursk, taking back some of that territory. That's a hugely important bargaining chip for Zelensky if we get into some negotiations over territory in a potential Trump administration. Give us your take on what's happening there.
Well, look, I mean, to begin with, I never expected the Ukrainians to hold the salient in Kursk, and I never expected Putin to be willing to negotiate for its return. What I expected it to do is what I think it largely has done, which is to soak up reserves that the Russians could otherwise have sent to reinforce their primary offensives in the east. And I think we've gotten ourselves a bit too much into the Russians didn't deploy troops away from the east, therefore this failed. But when I look at the list of airborne divisions and naval infantry divisions, which are the elite units in the Russian army that have gone to Kursk, all of them could have gone to advance the Russian offensive operations in the east. They didn't, and now they're dying to try to get Ukrainians off of Russian soil. That's a success. Putin is in the process of humiliating himself in a certain way by bringing in North Korean troops to liberate Russian territory. And I have to tell you, as a Russian military historian, it's possible I'll get this wrong, but I'm thinking that this may be the first time in Russian history that a ruler of Russia, had to bring in foreign troops to liberate Russian territory. I'm not sure that I can think of another time in history when that's happened. And that's kind of a big deal. The Russians have been conducting counteroffensive operations in Kursk for a long time. They've taken back some of it. The Ukrainians still hold a lot of it. Ukrainians have also been counterattacking into the counterattack and regaining territory. It's that Russians have a very tough fight. Ukrainians are severely outnumbered on that front, which is good, because it means that they have forced the Russians to amass a much larger concentration of troops than they themselves have sent there, and they are killing and taking prisoner a lot of Russian troops that are fighting up there. The North Koreans are arriving, and we will find out what their mettle is, and that will, I'm not going to make any comments about that, but it'll be interesting to see.
Have they still lowered the height requirement for the North Korean army? Is that still, did they send the tall ones to Russia or leave the short ones there to defend the DMZ?
The Ukrainians have been having a good time with information operations, offering them food. We'll see how that plays out.
That would be lovely to see mass defections.
So, Fred, exit question for me, and it's in the same vein, and I've asked you this on previous times that you've been on the podcast. Okay, so we have seen Russia invade Ukraine in 2022 and suck. They've gotten better. I don't want to downplay what they've done to the Ukrainians. I don't want to downplay any part of the seriousness of this. But in terms of our previous assessments of the Russians, OMFG is what, right, Putin should be saying to whatever bimbo he's with right now. Can I not rely on anybody? And must I do everything? Now, so we've seen the Russians. Okay, now the Iranians have had 2 bites at the Israeli apple in April and in October. In each case, it was a massive humiliation. Then the Israelis have had 2 bites at Iran. Ditto. In each case, right? The Iranians are nowhere near what they've cracked up to be. When I think about the axis of evil, and I don't include North Korea, because North Korea, I mean, they have a lot of unhappy people, automatons there, and they could be very dangerous to our troops in South Korea and everything else. So I don't want to downplay them. But if I'm Xi Jinping and I'm watching this, am I saying to myself, well, of course, they suck, but I am Xi Jinping and my people are Chinese communist men who will dominate? Or is he saying, what don't I know about my own troops?
So the excellent Coalition Defense of Taiwan project team, working with the excellent Institute for the Study of War China analytical team,
You've got an empire.
very, very early on picked up the various indications that Xi Jinping was having exactly the conversation with himself and then with his senior leaders and with some soon-to-be ex-senior leaders.
Right.
About, is there any propellant in those missiles, and is anything going to fly if somebody pushes the button?
Why isn't it pointy?
And exactly, and coming to the conclusion that possibly not. And so he has conducted purges of his senior military, especially the rocket forces and others. And he clearly is worrying about the quality of his force. Look, that's bad for us in a certain fundamental sense, because Putin made a very bad mistake. And what we're seeing is that Xi Jinping is determined to learn from that mistake. He is operating in a system that almost requires lying and concealing bad news, which is exactly how Putin got into this mess also. And Xi Jinping is trying to do this against the backdrop of consolidating his own personal power to give him an influence over China that is more like Mao's than anything that we've seen in recent Chinese history. That is not conducive to people actually telling the truth about problems in their organizations. So he is concerned about this and trying to fix it, but he's also operating in a system that's going to make that very difficult. I want to flag one thing, though. One thing we know. The Chinese are very interested in learning lessons from the war in Ukraine to use against us and our partners in the Asia Pacific. And we just had yet another report from the ISW Russia team today about exercises going on in Belarus to help the PRC learn how to use drones the way the Russians are using them and the way the Ukrainians are using them, not the way we've been talking about them in the Asia Pacific. So let me take the opportunity to flag a soon-to-be forthcoming paper from the Institute for the Study of War that I was privileged to oversee by analyst Riley Bailey, which is going to be lessons for Taiwan from Ukraine, that makes the argument that I think we really need to internalize, that as our adversaries are looking very hard to learn how future wars will be fought by looking at Ukraine, we are not doing that enough.
Amen.
And we need to get after this, and with urgency, because this is what war is going to look like.
I hope that's what some of what Elaine McCusker's new project is going to be doing, which is looking at potential contrarian outcomes and what they're going to cost us. Hey, Fred, it's always such a pleasure to have you on, and I know Mark and I both know how busy you are. So thank you for taking the time out, and kudos. You guys put out great material, great analytics, really, really fast for anybody who's not on following ISW and following CTP on X and getting their incredible emails that will make you sound smarter than the CIA. You should be getting them. And if you don't know how, just come and just email us at what the hell, and we'll pass it on.
And
Thanks
you were
so much.
here. You were here for Danny's Boris and Natasha imitation of "Must get moose and squirrel."
It was awesome. Thank you so much, guys.
Take care.
Okay. Take care, Fred.
Bye.
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 So, Danny, what do you think?
So we ended this conversation with something that I think really can be underestimated. America has this terrible habit of thinking about our allies as a group. Ooh, NATO's so important. Ooh, we have the Quad. Ooh, we have this, right? But we think of our enemies as discrete entities. Ooh, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Chinese. And of course, what Ukraine has done is unify these guys in common cause. And while we can maybe say that China is not planning to launch a war against the United States backed by the Russians, the Iranians, and the North Koreans, at this moment, we should have no doubt that they are on that battlefield in Ukraine, as Fred said, and they are taking lessons learned about how to kill us.
Yeah, so the Russians are attacking Ukraine with Iranian drones and North Korean troops. Yeah. I mean, and Chinese chips, because they've been cut off from the chip market, so they're getting their chips from China. So they're getting a lot of support from China that is non-lethal, but essential to their effort. I mean, this is a, whatever you want to call it, axis of evil, axis of hate, axis of terror. It actually has come true. George W. Bush was ahead of his time, and the reality is that these countries are working together. They're working in concert, and they've all been emboldened by this administration's fecklessness and fear of escalation. We've got wars raging on 2 continents right now, and it could happen on a third in very short order if we don't get our house in order.
You are 100% right. And the original sin here was Joe Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan. He is going to, before he leaves office, try and pull our troops mostly out of Iraq. He is going to try to draw down our troops in Syria. He is... a lot of us have had an argument about who the worst president in our lifetime is. You say it's Joe Biden. I say it's Barack Obama. But I think Joe Biden is going to go out strong. In other words, I may have to change my rating because he is going to leave his successor, whether it is Kamala or it is Trump, he is going to leave his successor with a situation in which really dangerous people are on the march in a way that we have paid zero attention to as we spend all of our time talking about who should use what toilet and whether cats are being eaten by Haitians in Ohio. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Iranians, all the bad guys are on the march.
America's back.
Let's see. I think what we mean by America's back is America's turned its back.
Yes,
but hopefully that'll change. Let's keep our fingers crossed because otherwise we are looking at some really, really nasty times ahead. And I don't think the next president, whoever it is going to be able to avoid them.
Well, you say the worst president was Barack Obama. I say the worst president was Joe Biden. We may be in violent agreement if the election turns out a certain way that Kamala Harris beats them both.
Oh, God. Defining deviancy down, as Moynihan used to say. Well, there it is. Hey, folks, thanks for being with us. Don't hesitate to share your thoughts about this. And another week to Election Day.
Oh, well, another few days till the next What the Hell is Going On podcast. So we're giving you an extra this week, but we got another great episode coming out very shortly.
Take care.
Bye. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.